Mark chapter 14. It all had to be used is the title of my message today. It all had to be used. Look at verses 1 and 2. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread was only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and to kill him. Note that. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. Now, 2 days away, it is guesstimated that about 3 million people would arrive into Jerusalem during this time. The Passover was very compulsory. In other words, if you were a Jewish believer, every male Jewish believer within 15 miles of Jerusalem would need to be there, and they showed up in mass. And you say, well, how would they know how many were there? The different people kept records of how many sheep were sold, and so and then you would have. It's interesting how they did this. How many sheep were sold during that time, and then and as you would eat the sheep, celebrate the Passover, you could do it with 10 people. 10 people. And so they would come together. And you remember the story of the Passover. If you're not, you would pick that up in Exodus chapter 12. And at the Passover feast, they would remember their deliverance from Egypt. They would kill a lamb, a firstborn lamb, pure. And with hyssop, they would smear the blood on each sides of the doorpost and over the lintel, the top of the door. And in Egypt, when this took place during the time that Moses was dealing with the Pharaoh and the plagues came upon Egypt, the last plague was the death angel that passed through the town and killed the firstborn. That would have been the first. Now, in my household, Diana and I and Eric, if we didn't put the blood over our home, would have been killed. Because she's a firstborn, I'm a firstborn, Eric is the firstborn. So then all that would have been left in our house would have been Brent. The firstborn would be killed. And then of your cattle, the firstborn of your cattle. It was the firstborn was to be killed. And so I don't know about you, but I being the firstborn, if I was a young boy at that time, I'd say to my dad, "Dad, you got the blood out?" In fact, I would most likely go out and look at it on the door sides and the top. How many here are firstborn? Would you have done that, you think? Would you have made sure the blood was out? Yeah. So then that is what the Passover, remember they would eat this feast of the Passover standing up. Why would they be standing? Because they're planning to leave. Once the Pharaoh's kids, son, or the firstborn was died during this Passover time, then, he said, "Get out of here." And you got to think, when the Jews left Egypt, the Egyptians were so glad that they were getting out of town that no longer did they have to put up with fleas, frogs, lice. You remember all the different plagues. All the people had to deal with that. And so they were giving them gold. They were giving them gold earrings, gold jewelry. Because if you remember back, when they made the golden calf, where did they get the gold to make the golden calf with? It was the stuff that the Egyptians gave them. And so the children of Israel went through the Passover. At that same time, there was the barley harvest that would take place. And so the priests would come, and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread marked the end of the barley harvest. And stalks of barley, they would take sheaves of garlic and wave it before the Lord in celebration. And you would read about that in Leviticus 23, 10 and 11. Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give to you, you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. You see that? So there would have been, so when Jesus was going in to Jerusalem, he says, now the Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread was only 2 days away. They were to celebrate the harvest. They would not sell any bread or grain or make any bread until they have done this offering unto the Lord. You know, in the last days of Jesus' life was to be lived out in a city filled with Jews who had come from the ends of the earth. They came to celebrate their deliverance from slavery in Egypt, and at the same time, God's blessing upon their harvest. And then, as I mentioned, the 3 million pilgrims in Jerusalem. Let's look at verse 3. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wage, and the money given to the poor. And they rebuked her harshly. Leave her alone, said Jesus. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on his body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, whenever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she had done will also be told in memory of her. Love's extravagance. Say that. Love's extravagance. When you fell in love with the lady you married or the guy you married, there had to have been some extravagance. Maybe going out, doing different things. Love's extravagance. When I married Diane and I went to pick up the engagement ring, I did it on my own. Nowadays, I guess couples go together and they buy it together, the engagement ring. I never even thought of that. It was my gift to her, so I didn't. People shouldn't tell you what you are to give them, right? So love's extravagance. So in this story, it tells us of the last act of kindness that was done for Jesus. Think about that. The last act of kindness. They were in the home of Simon the leper in Bethany. You say, why there, not in Jerusalem? Probably because of the 3 million people there, it would be hard to find a place to stay. It's kind of like going to Reno on those hot August nights and finding a place to stay. Have you ever been to Reno on a hot August night? See all those cars that are represented there? Anyway, he was in Bethany and lounging. That was the way they would eat and have a dinner meal. So you didn't sit around a table, but you would lounge, and they would have like a low-lying table, like a coffee table, and you would just gather your food or eat it with, like the Mexicans would have their tortillas, and they would, and in an Indian home, you would have that naan that you would rip and tear and eat with your hands. And in Jesus' day, they also had an unleavened bread that they would use to eat with. And if you go to Israel, you want to go to some Jewish restaurants and have the Jewish type of food that they would eat. And so they were lounging, and they would be reaching into the common pot and taking what they would want and eat and drinking their wine. And while they were there, a lady shows up and comes up behind Jesus, and she has a flask of perfume, a pure nard, and it was very, very, very expensive. Now the nard that was within the flask of alabaster flask, this basis for this came from India. I didn't know that, but it came out of India, so it had to have been brought by caravan, ship and boat caravan to get it to wherever they were, and then make this perfume. And it was highly fragrant. And so when this lady came with this flask of this you say, how expensive? A year's wage. Now, those of you that are doing your taxes, you can figure, what do you make a year? Now, I heard of a guy that makes 200 million a year. That's a lot of money. Anybody here make 200 million a year? Tani, bless you. But David was telling me that the founder of, what was that? He's a resident of one of the places we go, and he does music, and I do the Bible study. But he's there, but being cared for. But the value of this perfume was very highly. But an interesting thing, normally in the flask you would just take a few drops. Now, when I was a kid growing up, my dad would have this Old Spice cologne. That was his favorite. And, put it on this away. But with this nard, you wouldn't just pour it out. You would just a few drops. And now you have a bottle of stuff that has a spray thing on it, and you spray. But a few drops. I buy Diane some kinds of perfume, but I don't buy the expensive stuff. I like the Estee Lauder Youth Dew. I just like the smell of that. And so, when she runs out, I go buy it for her. And I don't buy it ahead. I just buy it when it runs out. And so, this perfume, some people don't wear perfume, and that's okay. So an interesting thing, instead of doing a few drops, she comes up behind Jesus, and it says she breaks the flask over, breaks it. She may have had a rock or something, and she held this flask over Jesus' head, and she breaks it. And all that nard comes out. Well, I've heard this forever, since I've been a Christian, and Jesus was right when he said, people will talk about this, and I'm talking about it here, in the end of March in 2019. But I didn't understand why she broke it. So I'm going to tell you why. And maybe you know why, but I didn't know why. First of all, it was a custom in the East that if you used a glass and you had a very important person come to and sit at your table, and you give him a glass of wine, a cup of, or whatever, and he used that glass, at the end of the feast, that person, that very important person, you would break the glass. And you would say, well, why would they break the glass? So no one of lesser value than that person would use that glass. Think that through. Remember, title of my message, it all had to be used. No one of lesser value would drink from that glass. Jesus, that lady, when she anointed Jesus, nothing would ever be put in that flask again, because the value of that act of putting it upon Jesus, never to be used again. Now you got to keep this in your head and think about it. She broke the flask and poured it all on Jesus' head because of the custom of the breaking of a glass. That was quite interesting to me. The custom in the East, they would wash the body of a dead person. This also was interesting in my study. And then they would anoint that person, and the flask that they had, that they used the anointment, then they would break it also. So the lady, when she broke that flask, no one of lesser value would ever use this flask. Now you got to think, they weren't thinking Jesus is going to die. He's trying to tell them this, but they just didn't get a clue, did they? You say, why? Well, because after his death on the cross, and they all acted as if they didn't know what was going on, didn't they? Even though he told them, it just went over their head. True? I mean, guys were on the road to Emmaus, So others were planning to go back fishing, But this flask had to be broken. The glass had to be broken. Now, her action caused some criticism of bystanders. The value a year's pay. Their attitude would be, what a shameful waste. Now, what a tragedy. Now, remember the extravagance of love. It all had to be used. And they're saying, what a shameful waste. This could be given to the poor. And Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 15:11. He says, you can help the poor at any time, but you don't have long to do anything for me. Interesting. Again, he tells them, she was anointing his body beforehand for his burial. Now you got to think this through. Remember when the ladies came after his death, and on that Sunday morning after the Sabbath day, and on that early Sunday morning, what were they going to do? They were coming to anoint his body. Right? They were to prepare his body for burial. I mean, he was just laying in the tomb with this kind of a linen sheet laying over his body. They were coming in to prepare for that burial, the long-term burial. Wrap his body, anoint him with oil. That had already been done. He had already been anointed. Didn't need to be done. And it wasn't done. Right? They get in, what? Tomb, the stones rolled away. The guards, the soldiers, I think a lot of them ran away. Right? The soldiers weren't there to roll the stone back for her, and they weren't there to protect it. Correct? I mean, the ladies, oh my goodness, what's going on? Look in, what are the tomb's empty. And then with the gardener, she thinks, well, where did you put him? Where did you put? She didn't know it was Jesus. Interesting. Very, very, very interesting here. But we come to this. She anointed his body beforehand for its burial. Now, take your green sheet out, because you get to fill in the blanks. Right? Okay, number 1. Love does lovely things. Love does. Love is never hard, stern, austere, or unattractive. Love should be winsome, lovely, filled with charm. Love should be a serendipity. Love. Unexpected pleasure. But love is what? Extravagant. Done. So love, what? Does lovely things. Secondly, love is extravagant. Love is extravagant. And then I have parentheses, it refuses to count the cost. Love refuses to count the cost. Correct? When I go, Christmas time comes, we save money so much every month. I started doing this when Bank of America would let you put money away for Christmas. That was when I was pastoring in Taft. Love is extravagant. I go to buy something for Diane, and she says, "Oh, I don't want anything." But you go to buy your wife something, you want to get her something nice. Love is extravagant. It just wants to do something in a beautiful day. There is a recklessness in love. Diane took a chance on marrying me. She fell in love. Even though she knew what it was like to live in a pastor's home, she still chose to marry a young man that was going to be a pastor. And in one of those rebellious times in her life, Diane, standing flat-footed, looked her mom in the face and said, "I am going to be smarter than you. I will never marry a preacher." Yeah, serious. Yeah, never. God sure got even with her, didn't he? See, love is extravagant. When she just had the love in her heart for me. She couldn't help herself but want to be my wife and have our children. Now, this is another thing on point number 3. I loved this when I came across this. Love never misses the moment to show love. The other day for dinner, we had the cauliflower pizza. How many is familiar with cauliflower? You make the crust out of cauliflower. Well, then what Diane does is she'll add, one of my favorite pizzas, is beef and onion. I like a beef and onion pizza. And so what she did was she made this cauliflower pizza. She put chunks of beef, hamburger beef on it, and onion, and then stuck it in the oven and baked it. And it was tasty. It was very good, considering the crust was cauliflower. Right? But it was good. But I didn't say at the dinner table, this was really tasty. So that night, while I was laying in bed and I fell asleep and woke up, and the Lord spoke to me and says, "You didn't think Diane," and I'd been working on this message and the extravagance, not missing a moment or an opportunity to show love. So in our world today, I don't sleep in until 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock. I'm normally up at 5 without an alarm clock. 5 o'clock comes, I'm awake. And so I would go into the front room and sit on the chair there and kind of wrap up in a blanket because the heaters are off in the house. And so finally, Jabez wakes Diane up because around 6:30, he starts whining and wants out of his kennel. So Diane gets up, brings him out, and lets him go to the bathroom. So she was walking over, and then she turns on the coffee, and I guess if I was smart, but I like drinking coffee with her, so why would I want to turn her on at 5 o'clock? And so, unless the Lord tells me. But I needed to tell her how much I appreciated that pizza. Now remember, the point here, love never misses a moment to show love. And she's standing there, and I could see her right now. And she's in her white robe, you know. She just has her nightgown on and slippers. And I'm there wrapped up in an Afghan. And I looked at her and I says, you know that pizza last night with the hamburger? Boy, that was really, really tasty. I really appreciated you making that. And a tear runs down her face. Whoa. We should, guys, listen to me. Ladies, listen to me. Love never misses a moment to show love. Show love. Show love to your grandkids, show love to your kids, but the showing of love. You know, love never misses the moment to show love. You know, sometimes it's the acts on the impulse. It's just that quick moment thing that you do. How often do we miss that moment? And it never comes again. Never comes again. How many know what I'm talking about? You had a moment to show love, you don't do it, and it never comes again. Never happens again. You just missed it. It's like fishing on the fishing boat. You don't want to miss that moment when the fish is taking the bait. You don't want to miss it. Now, there's certain fish, you jerk it like this, and crank them in. But on a salmon or a sturgeon, you got to be aware. And when that thing's just, your tip of your pole just moves just a little bit, you can miss it if you're not paying attention. And then you just start winding your bait in, and you'll hook your fish. You don't want to miss that moment. See, I don't want, that's why I would catch fish. Right, David? You got to be aware. You don't go fishing to take naps. It's an expensive nap. You'll come home with an empty gunny sack. But how often we miss that moment. Never comes again. Let's be like this woman who acted on her impulse of love. Acted on that impulse of love. Never ever again will anybody use this flask. Oh, by the way, when they would go in and balm that person and they would have their flask of spices and all, they'd break the flask and bury it with the person. Never to be used again. Never. It all had to be used. It all had to be used. Got to think this. Think this. You see, love always brings good news. Love always brings good news. See, Jesus went to the cross. That's the good news. Love talks about Jesus going to the cross. Extravagant love for you and me is Jesus Christ going to the cross. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Romans 5:8 says, "But God demonstrated his love towards us, in that while we were still lousy, stinking, vile sinners, Christ died for us." I want to sum all this up. All that we do, those of you in the worship team, playing the drums, playing the trumpet, playing the piano, playing the keyboard, what? Should be done out of love. Those of you that usher, and you come and you greet people and you give them the bulletin, or those that come and do the printing and do the paperwork this past week, getting everything ready for the Easter mailing, going down and getting the permits that we can mail, bulk mailing, and us doing it is a whole lot cheaper than having someone else do it. You have to pay them. You follow what I'm saying? But it all should be done because of a love in our heart. A love in our heart. Out of love. Love is extravagance, and in extravagance, it all has to be used. Love has to do something. True? Love. For God so loved the world. What did he do? Gave. Extravagantly, didn't he? Yeah. So I have to be used up. I've poured my life out. And I'm not going to take it back. Love has to be. And you're in charge. See, you have this life. This is the alabaster box right here. Within me is that precious nard. And what? I must be broken to pour it out. Love does. Let us stand.